Dawn, and thanks to everyone for joining the webinar this afternoon. My name is Elizabeth Siegel, and I am a policy analyst at the Council of State Governments Justice Center. Before we begin the webinar, I'd like to briefly talk through a couple of housekeeping items about how the webinar is going to work, and then take a brief moment to tell you a little bit about the National Reentry Resource Center. Please note that any time during this webinar, you can ask a question by typing it into the Q&A panel at the bottom right-hand portion of your screen. We'll keep a running list of the content-related questions that we receive and then respond to the questions during the last segment of the webinar. We'll do our best to get through as many questions as possible. If you encounter technical or audio problems during this webinar, please call WebEx Technical Support at 1-866-229-3239. Please understand that there are some technical issues that you may not be able to resolve, and for this reason, we're recording this event and we'll post it on our website at www.nationalreentryresourcecenter.org. We should have the webinar posted online early next week, and once it's been posted, we'll email you a link to the recording. Our presenters for today's webinar include Josh Weber and Gwendolyn Dilworth. Mr. Weber directs the Council of State Governments Justice Center's Juvenile Justice Program. Ms. Dilworth is the Juvenile Justice Specialist at the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, or OJJDP. Ms. Dilworth has nearly 30 years of experience in crime prevention, organizational development, project management, staff supervision, and instructional development and delivery. Ms. Dilworth joined OJJDP, the Office of Justice Programs, U.S. Department of Justice, in 1999. In her capacity as Juvenile Justice Specialist, she oversees federally funded projects covering a wide range of highly visible initiatives, cooperative agreements, and federal interagency agreements. The Second Chance Act, which was signed into law in 2008, is the first federal legislation passed by Congress to authorize federal support for reentry programs. Recognizing how complex reentry initiatives are and the importance of integrating research and evidence into those initiatives, the Second Chance Act authorized the creation of a National Resource Center for Adult and Juvenile Reentry. In 2009, following a competitive process, the Council of State Governments Justice Center was selected to launch the National Reentry Resource Center and provide training and technical assistance to all other Second Chance Act grantees. The Council of State Governments Justice Center administers the National Reentry Resource Center, or NRRC, in close partnership with the Bureau of Justice Assistance and OJJDP. Since 2009, the NRRC has provided technical assistance and training to close to 600 Second Chance Act grantees. Approximately 20% of all Second Chance Act grants have been targeted at reforming juvenile reentry systems, with select grant programs focused on specific populations and services. Technical assistance has included a variety of distance learning activities such as peer-to-peer conference calls, webinars, resource sharing, as well as on-site support and training. We're constantly adding new content and resources to the National Reentry Resource Center's website, and we send out monthly newsletters that provide information about the latest research, funding opportunities, distance learning events, and other news about reentry. To sign up for the newsletter, please visit the link www.csgjusticecenter.org/subscribe. Furthermore, our youth pages reflect the recent research on what works to improve reentry outcomes for youth involved in the juvenile justice system. You can access those youth-specific publications, resources, and announcements in the field by visiting www.csgjusticecenter.org/youth. During today's presentation, we'll start with an overview of the goals for this new grant program. We'll then describe the details of the award, provide a brief overview of eligibility criteria and the target population for this grant, and then elaborate further on some of the key details pertaining to some of the program-specific information and content of this grant. Ms. Dilworth will conclude with a discussion of the details pertaining to the application, and we'll spend the remainder of the session addressing your questions. Please note that there are additional details pertaining to this solicitation what we're reviewing in greater detail are the key program content items for which you should be familiar and some key application expectations. I'll now turn to Josh Weber, who will describe the goals of the Second Chance Act Juvenile Reentry Systems Reform Planning Program. Thanks, Josh.
Thank you, Liz, and thank you, everyone, for joining us this afternoon. So, most importantly, the goal of the Second Chance Act Comprehensive Juvenile Reentry Systems Reform Planning Program is to reduce recidivism and improve other key outcomes for youth reentering the community after a period of confinement. And so the heart of Second Chance is to improve outcomes for youth who are confined in a post-disposition facility and returning back to the community. One of the ways that this grant program differs from other previous Second Chance Act grant programs is it's very focused on jurisdiction-wide systems reform as opposed to very discrete policy or practice changes or services for new programs. And so what that means is OJJDP is looking for applications that are not to provide new services or a new program for a very small number of youth, but instead are looking for applications that seek to redesign and strengthen the way that the reentry planning process and services and supervision for these youth are held across the jurisdiction. For those of you who have applied for Second Chance Act grants before, this is a very important distinction. There's another solicitation that was recently released by OJJDP that is much more focused on discrete implementation projects, but the goal of this funding program is on larger systems reform. And in particular, that reform should really focus on the adoption, integration, and effective implementation of a set of principles and practices that rigorous research has shown works to improve youth outcomes. The solicitation Appendix A details what those principles and practices are. And so the goal of this grant program is to see jurisdiction-wide systems reforms to the reentry process that really advance that research as articulated in those principles and practices. In addition, there are three key reform areas that are being looked at as part of this grant program. The first is around risk and needs assessment and the use of those tools to make more effective decisions for youth who are in confinement and upon their reentry. And so one important point of clarification around this grant cannot be used to divert youth from placement. But instead, this reform area is around using risk and needs assessment tools to better serve young people while they are in placement, to better determine how long they need to be there for best impact, and to help guide release decisions and the services that youth receive when they come back to the community. The second key reform area is around jurisdictions' approach to pre-release services and planning and post-release services. And so this speaks to the need for applicants to think through what actually happens to youth in confinement, what services that they receive, what kind of re-entry planning occurs while youth are in confinement, and the transition from confinement to the community, and then the services and as well as the supervision that youth receive when they're in the community. So thinking about the reentry process as from the moment youth are placed in the facility all the way through their successful reentry, and looking for systemic changes to that process that are really designed to improve outcomes. And then the third key reform area is based on the research that suggests it's important to not just what to do, but in order to get better outcomes, how to do it. And so the third key reform area is around using quality assurance protocols and processes, data collection, and a more data-driven approach to improve the fidelity of services and supervision that's provided to youth in facilities and upon reentry. And so those are the three key systems reform areas that this application is looking for. Jurisdictions don't necessarily need to hit on all three of those areas, but the systems reforms being identified and being funded by this grant should encompass at least one of those three areas.
Thank you, Josh. So let's turn our attention to the amount of awards and length of awards. So OJJDP will make as many as 8 planning awards this fiscal year, and planning awards will be as high as $100,000. The initial award period will be for a 12-month project period, and when grantees complete their strategic planning process, which means the completion of their entire plan, OJJDP will invite them to submit applications for implementation grants of between $1 to $2 million to implement these plans. Also, please note the funding decisions for implementation grants and who will receive these grants will be quite a competitive process and will depend on both the quality and competitiveness of a grantee strategic plan, and also include and consider progress and performance made during the planning period. And then OJJDP expects to make as many as 4 total implementation awards. In terms of eligibility criteria, so please be aware there are several ways you can be eligible for this grant. First, you're eligible if you're a state juvenile correctional agency. The second way you're eligible is if you're a juvenile justice agency that oversees the reentry process for youth placed in local correctional facilities post-disposition. And then lastly, note that you're also eligible if you're a state planning agency, which includes state advisory groups. In terms of target population, so since the solicitation really focuses on the development of a comprehensive systems reform plan to reduce recidivism rates and improve youth outcomes, your target population really must be large enough of a population of confined youth to measurably impact jurisdiction-wide youth reentry outcomes. And furthermore, this population of youth should be assessed as high risk for reoffending as determined through the use of validated risk assessment instruments. Also note that targeted youth must be admitted to your program prior to their 18th birthday. The program may continue to implement its juvenile reentry plan for these youth beyond their 18th birthday. OJJDP doesn't have a timeline for terminating these services, but instead youth can continue in the program as long as deemed therapeutically necessary. So I'll now turn this portion of the presentation over to Josh. Thanks, Josh.
So one of the key aspects of this grant program is a very specific definition for success and ensuring that all grantees are prepared to measure success in this way. And so the first way that success is defined using these grant funds is improvements in recidivism rates. And so jurisdictions are going to be asked to establish baseline recidivism rates for the population, the target population of young people to be served by this grant, to identify improvement targets for reducing that recidivism rate, and then demonstrating progress towards achieving those targets. Similarly, given that these are young people, we believe it's important, and OJJDP believes it's important to not merely focus on recidivism, but also to focus on other positive youth outcomes. And so jurisdictions are also asked to set a baseline for a priority set of positive outcomes for the target population, and similarly to identify improvement targets and demonstrate annual progress towards those improvement targets. And so an example of the kind of positive youth outcomes that a jurisdiction might establish is establishing a baseline rate for the academic progress that youth achieve on average in facilities, and setting a goal to try to increase the academic progress that youth achieve in facilities. Another example would be the percentage of young people who re-enroll back in school within a given time period when they are released from facilities, and making improvements in that. The application recognizes that not all jurisdictions may have the capacity to establish realistic and valid baseline recidivism rates and other outcomes, and that data is often a challenge for many jurisdictions, but also believe that it's essential to be able to measure the impact of these very significant funds on these important outcome measures. And so in applications, applicants must be able to either speak to existing capacity to establish these baseline rates and measure improvement, or demonstrate that by the end of the year-long planning period, through the additional funding they will receive during the planning period, as well as additional efforts that the jurisdiction will make, that by the end of the planning period, when implementation might begin, they will have the capacity to track and measure those outcomes. The next key element of the Second Chance Act grant program are 11 mandatory requirements that are set forth in the legislation around the Second Chance Act that every jurisdiction who receives a grant must meet. The core of those mandatory requirements are a Juvenile Reentry Strategic Plan that describes the state's long-term goals around reducing recidivism, as well as improving other outcomes for youth, and the reentry strategy for achieving those goals. In addition, jurisdictions are expected to establish a juvenile reentry task force that has very broad and deep representation from all of the key agencies, including juvenile correctional agencies, other government agencies, community-based service providers, and a wide representation of all of the key stakeholders necessary for youth reentry success. As part of those mandatory requirements, jurisdictions are also required to develop a reentry implementation schedule, a sustainability plan, an evidence-based methodology and outcome measurement plan, as well as identify the barriers to achieving that plan and how they hope to overcome those barriers and replicate the project if successful. We recognize that not every jurisdiction will be able to have all of these 11 elements in place before or during the application process, but it is expected that applicants, as part of their application, demonstrate their current progress in achieving these mandatory requirements and will work during the 12-month planning phase to continue to accomplish them. Very specifically, the grant requires grantees during the 12-month planning phase to focus and meet a set of deliverables that relate to those mandatory requirements. In order for grantees to move on or be competitive for the implementation phase, all grantees will have to have completed these specific deliverables and use their resources during the planning phase to continue to accomplish these deliverables. The key deliverables include establishing a task force or committee that oversees the development and the implementation of a juvenile reentry systems reform strategic plan. The second key deliverable related to the recidivism and positive youth outcomes that are mentioned earlier is an outcome measurement and evaluation plan that must include the specific baseline rates, the improvement targets, and how the jurisdiction will collect data on an ongoing basis to measure and evaluate progress around those improvement targets. The third key deliverable is a Juvenile Reentry Systems Reform Plan that details how the jurisdiction will accomplish those outcomes. The National Reentry Resource Center will help support jurisdictions to develop that systems reform plan through a comprehensive guided self-assessment that supports jurisdictions to review all of the most rigorous research on what works to improve juvenile reentry outcomes against their current policies and practices. With the facilitated support of the National Reentry Resource Center, jurisdictions will then identify their strengths and weaknesses related to that research, and then will identify some priority reform areas for systemic policy and practice change and capacity building activities in one of or more of the three reform areas mentioned at the beginning of this webinar. Subsequently, in preparation for the potential implementation grant, jurisdictions will be asked to develop an implementation plan with very clear tasks and timelines and deliverables for how those systems reform goals and activities will be accomplished, as well as a sustainability plan to ensure that after the potential implementation grant is awarded, jurisdictions will be able to sustain these new systems reforms with their own resources.
Great, thank you, Josh. So I'll now turn this portion of the webinar over to Ms. Dilworth from the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, who will describe some of the key aspects and expectations for this application.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you.
I'm going to spend just the next few minutes going over the applications, and if you bear with me for just 1 minute, my phone is saying my battery is low, so I'm going to switch phones. Okay, sorry about that. If you follow along with the slide, you'll see that there are sections I'm going to cover, and the pages with the detail for that information are listed, so you can get much more detailed information by going to these pages. But I'm going to take you through these now so that you get an idea of what we're expecting. The first area I'm going to cover is collaboration with federal agencies and give you a little more information about that. The Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention and the Bureau of Justice Assistance work closely together on the Second Chance Act implementation to support both juvenile and adult reentry efforts. OJJDP and BJA are also working with the National Institute of Justice, which is another component within the Office of Justice where OJJDP and the Bureau of Justice Assistance are located, to support the research and evaluation activities called for in the Act. You have already heard from staff from the National Reentry Resource Center who will be integral to the success of selected candidates. Again, OJJDP and BJA collaborate on the oversight of the National Reentry and Resource Center to provide intensive and targeted technical assistance to successful candidates. So it's important to understand that once awards are made, those who receive the awards will have additional support from OJJDP and the National Reentry and Resource Center. Similarly, BJA and the Federal Work Group on Corrections have prepared the Tribal Law and Order Act long-term plan to build and enhance tribal justice systems, also known as the Tribal Justice Plan, which covers recommendations and action steps to support the successful reentry of tribal members. Now let's look at mandatory requirements. A juvenile reentry strategic plan describing the state's long-term reentry strategy, including measurable annual and 5-year performance outcomes relating to the long-term goals of reducing recidivism and increase in public safety are a focus of this grant. And Josh did a fine job of providing specific details around that. Performance outcomes should address a variety of factors, such as education, reduction in violations of conditions of supervised release, mental health, treatment, and so forth. A detailed juvenile reentry implementation schedule and sustainability plan for the program is also required. Also required is evidence of a juvenile reentry task force comprised of all appropriate stakeholders who are listed on page 3, who are listed in number 3 on page 9, including the roles that each partner will play, whether through a memorandum of agreement or a memorandum of understanding. Likewise, there should be a discussion of the role of state corrections departments, community corrections agencies, and local secure confinement systems in ensuring coordination for successful reentry of juveniles into their communities. Documentation should reflect clear support of the Chief Executive Officer of the applicant and how this office will remain informed and connected to the activities of the program. You'll also describe the evidence-based methodology and outcome measures that will be used to evaluate the program and discuss how these measures will be used to assess the impact of the program to reduce recidivism. Finally, you'll indicate how the project could be replicated if it's shown to be effective. Now we'll take a brief look at the budget. As Elizabeth said, OJJDP will award up to $100,000 for this planning grant. And as Josh stated earlier, there's a distinct difference between previous reentry planning awards that OJJDP has made in the past and this particular award. This particular award will look more specifically at systems change. So we're not looking at changes within a local or a small program at this point. The award is for 12 months, I think, as Elizabeth said, and we will make up to 8 awards. Let's see. There is a match requirement for this award, and I've already received some calls regarding this. There's a 50% match requirement. 25% of the match is required in cash. But 25%, the remaining 25% of the award can be an in-kind contribution of goods or services directly related to the purpose of the grant. There's also a match waiver. The Attorney General may waive the match requirement if there's a determination of the applicant's fiscal hardship. Now, if you want your application to be considered under the match waiver, applicants must submit a match waiver request as a separate attachment, and it needs to be titled Match Waiver to their application. And you can find more information on that in the budget section, pages 14 to 15. The other thing I want to mention is the formula for calculating matches, because we often get inquiries around confusion how that's done. But again, if you look at the application, there's a sample and the formula for producing that or calculating that budget, the budget match on pages 14 and 15. Performance measures. More information on that can be found on pages 15 to 17, but in general, the department is looking for Hello?
Hi,
Yes,
Gwen.
Gwen, you're there.
Oh, okay. My phone went
We lost your.
out of area. Sorry about that.
That's all right. We got you now.
Okay. So what we are asking people to do is you will be required to provide data that will inform OJJDP and the reentry program on what you're doing. And so that information can be found on pages 15 to 17, as I stated earlier. Now we're going to jump to what an application should include. On pages 19 to 24 of the application, there's detailed information about the completion of the application. It will describe for you what needs to be included in the abstract, the program narrative, the budget detail worksheet, and there is a website there for you to pull that sheet down and then include the information necessary there. Then there's also information on the budget narrative. The budget narrative describes what the budget detail worksheet has listed as costs. It provides the justification for those the budget detail worksheet costs, and it also should describe how the costs that are being requested will maximize the effectiveness of the grant expenditures. Indirect costs, I've gotten some questions about that. Indirect costs are applicable if the organization or if the primary applicant already has an indirect cost rate. And there's information on that you'll find in the application. Let's see. Performance measures. Applicants who receive funding under this solicitation must provide data that measure the results of their work done under this solicitation. OJP will require any award recipient post-award to provide data requested through this application. And if you look at specifically pages 16 to 17 in the application, you'll see the measures that are required for this particular solicitation. Project evaluations, I'm not sure how much of that will be applicable at this stage, where the focus right now will be on planning. But the plan will include an evaluation plan, so I encourage you to read page 18 under project evaluation. And then as we look at what an application is expected to include, the first piece of information will be the SF-424, which is a standard form, and it serves as the cover sheet for submission of the pre-application, and it provides important information. Secondly, the project abstract, which I mentioned before, but the project abstract summarizes the proposed project in 400 words or less, and page 19 of the application gives you very specific detail around what information we will be looking for in that section. And it's the same theme for the program narrative, the statement of the problem, the goals and objectives, program objectives, performance measures, which I've touched on, and then project design implementation. At this stage, you are asked to detail how the project will operate during this planning phase. And you'll be asked to describe the process and strategies that you will use to accomplish the task force and to implement the planning phase of this project. You'll be asked to attach a logic model. The logic model will graphically illustrate how the performance measures are related to the project's problems, goals, objectives, and design. You'll find a sample logic model. The website is listed on page 22 of the application. You'll be asked to prepare and submit a timeline or milestone chart that indicates major tasks associated with the goals and objectives, assigns responsibility for each, and plots the completion, or at least the anticipated completion, of each task by month or quarter for the duration of this award. You'll be asked to indicate your capabilities and competencies. In other words, we're asking applicants to describe how they are qualified to apply for this project, and to clearly delineate the competencies that show evidence that the applicant is competent to conduct this program. Finally, we will ask for letters of support or memorandum of understanding that indicates other stakeholders who are key to the success of the planning effort, their commitment to be involved and engaged in this process. The application will also include the budget detail worksheet and budget narrative, which I've gone over briefly, and there's additional information about that on pages 23 and 24 of the application. Also on page 24 is more discussion on the indirect cost rate and how you go about determining whether you're eligible to request an indirect cost rate. Selection criteria. On page 26 of the application, it gives you the rankings that determine how the applications are rated, because the statement of problem, the goals and objectives and performance measures, the project design and implementation, the capabilities and competencies, and the budget all compose the rankings that will determine the percentage of points that an application will receive. Page 26 of the application package also discusses the review process. Peer reviewers will review the applications submitted under this solicitation that meet basic minimum requirements. Peer reviewers will rate these and any resulting recommendations that they have are advisory only. All final award decisions will be made by the Assistant Attorney General, who will consider factors including but not limited to underserved populations, geographic diversity, strategic priorities, past performance, and available funding when making awards. There, on page 27 of the application is information on additional requirements. They're bulleted, and you can read that and follow that information for yourself. On page 29 and through pages 30, you'll see additional information on how to apply. The first step, of course, is to go to www.grants.gov to get information on how to register. The first thing you want to do is register to submit an application. Then you want to make sure, if you go to page 29 of the application, make sure that you have items numbers 1 through 5, because these, items number 1 through 7, because these will be required as well. They include your DUNS number, your SAM information, identification of an authorized representative for this application. And trying to think what else. Response to disclosure of lobbying activities, submission of a valid application that's consistent with the solicitation. And those are the key considerations. It's a lot, but I think we've done a good job of detailing these things out generally for you. And so with that, Elizabeth, I'll turn it back to you.
Great. Thank you, Gwen. So just finally, please note the deadline for this grant application, which is May 13th. And also be sure to refer to the full solicitation for details on registering for grants.gov. You will need an account prior to applying for the grant, and there are some important time-sensitive next steps, so please refer to that closely. Also, OJJDP has provided an important notice regarding applying for grants in grants.gov, so definitely turn your attention to that. For more information and a copy of the full solicitation, we've created a link that's on the PowerPoint slide for your reference. Lastly, we'd like to call your attention to a recently released solicitation from the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention called FY14 Second Chance Act 2-Phase Juvenile Reentry Demonstration Program. It's a planning and implementation solicitation. And it's a new program that provides up to $750,000 to help states and local governments and federally recognized Indian tribes an opportunity to plan and implement programs and strategies that support the successful reentry of youth released from confinement. And this is a unique opportunity that's kind of added to this opportunity that we're describing because it reflects sort of an enhanced emphasis on the adoption, integration, and effective implementation of those key principles and practices that research demonstrates improves juvenile reentry outcomes. The deadline for that grant is June 2nd, so similar to the presentation today, the National Reentry Resource Center, in partnership with OJJDP, will host another webinar for this specific solicitation, and that will be taking place on Thursday, May 8th, from 2 o'clock to 3 o'clock p.m. Eastern Time. And you should expect to receive a registration link for this solicitation webinar in the near future. So please be on the lookout for that. So we're going to spend the remainder of the webinar addressing some of the questions that have come in. I wanted to start by just clarifying some items around eligibility. So if you have received a Second Chance Act planning grant where you're developing a strategic plan, you are eligible for this grant. So I just wanted to make that clear. If you are a county agency, you're also eligible for this specific grant. And thirdly, all federally recognized Indian tribes are also eligible. So that's why I reminded those three key pieces of information. We received a question around funding for services. So one of the questions that came in was, can I use some of the cash funding support for this grant to create more services for the youth in confinement or in the community? The answer to that is yes, but we encourage you to think carefully around what those services are and sort of the needs those services are meeting. Again, as Josh and Gwen explains, this grant is really about sort of revamping one's approach to juvenile reentry and creating more systems change. So really those services should be enhancing the model that exists for youth in confinement or in the community, or they should be, providing support around a new approach to meet some maybe unsupported needs among your youth, such as behavioral health disorders or other unmet areas. So that's really important to keep in mind. We received... Sure.
If I can just add to that, because it is an important point of clarification. Given that this grant is focused on systems reform, it recognizes that the services that youth receive in facilities and the services they receive to support their reentry process are essential to reducing recidivism and improving other youth outcomes. The distinction, though, that this grant application is looking for is, for example, if you are currently providing services to 50 youth of a given service model, this grant is not designed to provide additional funding so you can increase those services and provide those same services to 100 youth. Instead, it's designed to help you rethink whether the services that those youth are receiving at all are appropriate and how to make those services more evidence-based, how to make them more developmentally appropriate, and how to provide and adopt more quality assurance processes and mechanisms, as well as data collection and other supports to make sure that the services that are actually being implemented are of high quality and actually have fidelity to what the research says works to improve youth outcomes. So the funds can be used for services, but are meant to help to support you to redesign and strengthen the approach to those services so that they're more effective in ways that reflect the research as outlined in Appendix A of the solicitation.
Thank you for making that distinction, Josh, because I want to echo that. So, because I've gotten so many inquiries, and it's real clear that a number of people are reading this application as a continuation of what they currently do, and it is not. It is, I think Josh did a fine explanation of the distinction between the two. We're looking now at what you have learned from what you're doing and how that can be used to improve the system, not to provide services per se. Unless you are ready to move to the next phase that engages other systems to use yours as a model, but definitely not to continue services, the continuation of existing services. So I hope that's clear because it's a critical distinction. Thank you.
Thanks, Gwen. So, Gwen, I have a few questions that came in I think are directed to you. The first is if the applicant is the state juvenile justice and correctional agency that oversees the reentry process for youth, is a letter of support necessary, and is the letter of support required for future external collaborations for the reentry task force? I'm not sure if you need clarification on that question.
So Liz, I can try to tackle that.
Sure. Okay.
So if the applicant is the state juvenile justice correctional agency or the county juvenile correctional agency that oversees the reentry process, then a letter of support from that agency would obviously not be needed. And in fact, other than state advisory groups, it is only the state correctional agency that oversees the reentry process or the county equivalent agency that are eligible for this award. Where letters of support become important are to show that there is buy-in and collaboration from other state or county agencies that are critical members of the reentry task force, as well as showing that there is executive-level support within those state agencies for this reentry systems reform planning effort.
Great, thank you. So we have another few questions around cash or in-kind matches. So the first question is around, would an agency's staff salaries who are working on this project be considered cash or in-kind match? And secondly, is there a match in the implementation grant beyond 1 year?
Gwen, are you still there?
I don't know if she's still here with us.
I think we might have lost Gwen.
Yeah, we may have lost Gwen.
So we can provide more clarification on the agency staff salary question. The National Reentry Resource Center isn't able to answer that, but we can get back to the specific person who asked that and make sure that it's posted on the FAQ. But in terms of is the match in the implementation grant, is there a match going to be required there as well? And the answer to that is yes. The Second Chance Act legislation requires that there is a match. The exact level has yet to be determined, but there will be likely a similar match requirement as during the planning phase.
Okay.
This is Sean. I think that we have Gwen back. Gwen, are you there?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, Gwen, are you there? Great.
Yep.
Great. Hi, Gwen.
Hi.
We were just asking some application-specific or addressing some application-specific questions. So we have a couple more. We have about 5 minutes left. So is there, one of the questions, Glenn, is there a budget worksheet and narrative included in the 30-page limit for the program, that narrative, or is that separate?
That's a good question. I'm trying to think back. The budget narrative and the detailed worksheet are attachments. So what's included in the 30 pages is the abstract, the narrative, the implementation plan. I'm trying to get back to that page. Actually, I take that back. The budget narrative is included in the 30 pages. The only thing that would not be included is if they wanted to go into additional detail around the budget, although I don't know why, someone would want to do that. But those components that I discussed in the application part are all required components of the budget. Of the application. So, okay, now I have it. It's the project abstract, the narrative, the statement of the problem, goals and objectives, performance measures, project design and implementation, the logic model, the timeline, capabilities, the budget narrative and budget detail worksheet. The letters of support are attachments. They are not counted in the 30-page limit.
Okay. Great. Thank you, Gwen.
Okay.
We have another question that came in, and that is, can applicants utilize their own logic model, or is it an expectation that the applicant utilize the same logic model inside the solicitation?
They can utilize their own logic model. Obviously, because we review so many applications, it's helpful if there's some uniformity to the submission, but they're not required to use the design that we are recommending. So that's my response to that.
Great. Thanks, Gwen.
Okay.
I think the last question we received from participants is who they should call for specific questions related to their state.
In reference to what?
I'm not sure. I'm going to ask that the individual who asked that question just clarify a bit for us.
Okay, because if it's in reference to questions about the application, there's contact information right on the face page. But if it's in reference to trying to identify who their partners might be, they may want to contact their state criminal justice office, or the state juvenile justice office would be a good place to start.
Great. Thank you.
Okay.
For the answer. So we got another question. Can the reward be used to train correctional staff? And the answer to that is yes. I think we're coming up on 3 o'clock p.m., but I'm going to wait to see if there are any remaining questions that folks have. Okay. Great. Well, it is 3 o'clock, and this concludes today's webinar. If you do have any questions on eligibility, please do let us know. We do have one more question that came in around employing consultants to assist the reentry process. The one last question I wanted to get in there. The question is, can the award be used to employ consultants to assist the reentry process?
If the reference is to the development of the systems reform, certainly.
Okay, great. Excellent. Well, again, thank you all for participating in today's webinar. After you exit the webinar, a brief survey will appear on the screen. By answering the questions in the survey, you'll be helping the National Reentry Resource Center improve on the services we offer. We greatly appreciate it if you would just take a few minutes to complete the survey. And we'll be emailing a link to the recording of this presentation, as well as a link to a PDF of the PowerPoint slides used in the presentation early next week. These links will also be made available on the National Reentry Resource Center's website, which is www.nationalreentryresourcecenter.org. And then finally, as a reminder, I encourage you to subscribe to the National Reentry Resource Center's newsletter through the following website, www.csgjusticecenter.org/subscribe. Thanks, everyone, and have a great day.